Claire loves flair. Tom's into bootcut. Ava likes denim on denim. And Sarah is all about a cropped jean jacket. Whatever your denim look is, Walmart's got you covered. Find the things you love at Walmart.
Freshly made ravioli or hand-pulled ramen noodles. When you dine with Chase Sapphire Reserve, either will be amazing. Because it's the choice between a front row seat at the chef's table while getting a live demo of how to make ravioli, or dining family style as you hear the story behind your ramen broth. This weekend it's ravioli. Next weekend, ramen. Find the detail that moves you with immersive dining experiences from Sapphire Reserve. Chase, make more of what's yours. Learn more at chase.com/Sapphire Reserve.
Cards issued by J.P. Morgan Chase Bank, N.A. member FDIC. Subject to credit approval.
Listeners, today on the show, we have such a special treat for you. We have none other than India Hicks here to talk about her new book about her lovely mother called Lady Pamela, My Mother's Extraordinary Years as Daughter to the Viceroy of India, Lady in Waiting to the Queen, and Wife of David Hicks, which came out September 3rd. Lady Pamela Hicks, born of Mountbatten, is the daughter of Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was Viceroy to India and a first cousin of the late Prince Philip. Lady Pamela served as a bridesmaid at the 1947 wedding of Philip to then Princess Elizabeth, and later as a lady in waiting to Queen Elizabeth. Lady Pamela married David Hicks in 1960, and they have 3 children, the youngest of which, India, has written this truly beautiful book and is our guest today. Lady Pamela was even portrayed on the first season of Netflix's The Crown, and it's easy to see why a book needed to be written about her marvelous life, and she's fortunately still with us today. She's a fabulous 95 years old. Her daughter, India, is a designer, writer, businesswoman, former model, and interior designer. Truly, there is not much you haven't done in your own extraordinary life, India, but India has her own line of jewelry. She's a renowned philanthropist, and she is King Charles's goddaughter. In 1981, she was a bridesmaid in the wedding of her godfather to Lady Diana Spencer. This book is her 6th, and we are so excited to have you here with us today to talk about it. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much indeed. Goodness, that was quite a generous
I
line.
know. I was like, gosh, well, there's 2 fabulous lives that we're introducing here, right? And 2 fabulous women. And just so thrilled to have you here. This book, as we were just talking about in the pre-show, is absolutely lovely. It's filled with such rich photos. We'll talk about those in a minute. It is such a tribute to a well-lived life, your mother's. And you write of your mother, Lady Pamela Hicks, having lived a life in the shadow of her extraordinary parents, Queen Elizabeth, and her husband, felt time to dedicate a book to my mother's rich and varied life despite her protests. So I'm very interested in the despite her protests part of that sentence. But first of all, why did you feel that you needed to bring your mother, I guess, out of the shadows through this book? And why was right now the right time to write it?
Well, I thought that it is interesting that she has had 95 years of life. She was born in 1929, and so her perspective on life is very interesting. The looking back, and in fact, one of the final chapters we call Farewells, Funerals, and the Future. It's interesting that we have a woman who is still alive, and we can celebrate the extraordinary history that she's seen unfold in front of her eyes. Not just that she herself had a front row seat at many of these historical occasions, but also the perspective that she brings and the lessons that we can learn from these 95 years of life.
Well, Rachel kind of mentioned that you mentioned protests. So I want to focus on your words, despite her protests. You write in the acknowledgement section that you were thankful for her, and I'm quoting you, letting me tell her story. So what were her protests when it came to you writing the book, and what made her agree to do it?
Well, she's of the generation and the upbringing where it's not about you. It's about looking out, not looking in. And she feels that we have, as a society and in an age, become all about me, me, me. And she's right. We are rather a snowflake. We're in a snowflake moment. And she feels that those words that Prince Philip said, which was look up, look out, do more and say less, is so appropriate. So to have a book written about her, she didn't really want that because it's not about her. But I think she allowed me to do it because I was talking about her life, and I persuaded her that actually I thought that it was captured so much history and a disappearing world where duty and service was very important, where manners came first, where curiosity was the secret to a broader life, whereas a sense of fun and adventure and humor was still very important, but we could learn from much of what she's seen and lived. Mm-hmm. And I think she felt that actually she understood what I was beginning to say.
Mm-hmm. Well, the words in the book, and obviously we're so happy that you wrote this book. The words in the book are beautiful, but the photos, I mean, this book is essentially a coffee table book. It is actually sitting on my coffee table. I'm looking at it right now, and it's filled with these incredible photos of your mother and her marvelous life. This is probably an impossible question, but is there a standout among standouts when it comes to the photos that just capture, I mean, I could pick a few, like just that captures you and says, man, that's a very telling photo of my mother's life? Do you have a favorite photo from the book, or is that just impossible to choose?
Well, rather than calling this a coffee table book, we're calling it an illustrated biography.
Yes, that's right. That's right. That was in the press materials. I think that's brilliant.
Yeah, so this illustrated biography, I think, does capture much of my mother's life, but asking which images. There is probably one for me and one for my mother. She very much wanted me to include, in fact, the only thing she asked was that we included the picture of her winning the ladies' race in Malta. She's on a horse and she's there winning, and it's very exciting. It's a wonderful photograph for her because it was such a sense of achievement. For me, I felt that actually including that image was incredible because the way she's winning it, she is wearing a pith helmet and incredibly stylish sunglasses. So I thought from a fashion point of view, it was very funny as well. But I find there's one image where it is just a tiny speck. You see the tiny speck of my mother and the tiny speck of our late Queen Elizabeth. And they're sitting on a ship and they are surrounded by all the cadets and the Navy officers on this ship. And it's two women very much in a man's world. And I think about that quite a lot, about how young our Queen was when she took to the throne, and how young my mother was when she became a lady in waiting. And they embarked on 2 Commonwealth tours, and how difficult it must have been for these women in such a man's world. Yeah. And that really struck me.
There are so many photos, India, that just took my breath away. And there's also, I should mention, some really great photos in here of Queen Elizabeth too. I mean, obviously, because your mother and Queen Elizabeth were very close, and those took my breath away too. And you're right, you do see how very young Queen Elizabeth was when she began her reign. It's just absolutely beautiful.
Your mother accompanied her parents to India in 1947 and remained with them throughout her father's term as Viceroy of pre-independence India and later Governor General of post-partition India. So India means a great deal to her, and it is, after all, your name, the name of her daughter. So I'm sure there has to be a connection between the two.
Absolutely. I was given the great honor of carrying the name India because my grandfather was the last viceroy and I was the last grandchild. And of course, I was born a long time ago myself, 67. And there were no other Indias that I knew of or that we had come across. And now there are quite a few. And I'm always like, what is your reason for being called India?
It might be you, India Hicks.
Well, let's hope that there's a reason. But I felt very honored that I did have the name India, and I've been many times. And you're right in saying that my mother was there during the transition of power. And all of her friends, when she came back to England, she found it very difficult to adapt because all of her friends were Indian and she'd seen the birth of a nation and she lived through this extraordinary moment in history. And I think it was difficult when she came back to England, where all her friends had married sensible men with large estates and grand titles. And my mother felt rather Indian herself.
Well, Lady Pamela, as we've mentioned, was a bridesmaid at the wedding of then Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip in 1947. You write in the book, I found this so fascinating, that my mother was always struck by how deeply in love they were. Can you tell us more about that? Obviously, they had a 73-year marriage, and you can't have one of those without being deeply in love. But tell us more what you mean about that.
My mother always remembers that when the Queen got married, and my mother was there as a bridesmaid, as you say, and there were wonderful things that happened on the day, but also some mishaps. The Queen's pearl necklace broke just as she was getting ready. The bouquet disappeared. Nobody knew where to find it. And throughout it all, my mother always says she remained unbelievably calm. But that moment when they're on the balcony of Buckingham Palace and they see the hundreds of thousands of well-wishers who have come to see them on that balcony and wish them well on their day of their wedding. And as the police move forward and the crowd surged towards the gates of Buckingham Palace, she said she could hear the crowds, especially the women, all singing "Every Nice Girl Loves a Sailor," which was kind of fun. And my mother said, of course, it was absolutely true, because every young girl in England had fallen in love with Prince Philip because he was so incredibly dashing. So I think we had a very beautiful young princess, and we had a very dashing young Greek prince. So it was quite a fairy tale beginning. Of course, though, the Queen then ascends to the throne much quicker than she imagined. Her father died at only age 59 before she could ever imagine that he was going to die. And it was a terrible shock. They were actually out in Kenya at the time. And the royal party were probably some of the last in the world to hear the news that the Queen's father had died. Devastating for the young princess.
Yeah,
Yes,
I actually want to talk about that.
Yeah.
She was a lady in waiting to Queen Elizabeth and was there, like you said, in Kenya in 1952 when King George VI died unexpectedly and Elizabeth became queen. So what was that moment like for her to witness that?
Well, my mother said it was a real reflection of who the Queen was, and that she was so utterly selfless, and that her first reaction on hearing the news was obviously to lean into Prince Philip, to have that moment of absolute shock. But she came back in and said to my mother and the private secretary, Martin Charteris, "I'm so sorry, but this means we're going to have to go back to England." Just the fact that she was immediately thinking about them, and the chaos that was going to ensue in having to cancel the rest of the Commonwealth tour in getting herself back to England. But one extraordinary moment was when they arrived at the airport in Nairobi. The world's press had had time to arrive with their cameras to try and take a picture of the Queen leaving. And Martin Charteris went out and said to the press, please, out of respect for our Queen in mourning, don't take a photograph. And they all put their cameras at their feet, and there's not one photograph of the Queen leaving. And imagine today the press responding with such respect.
It would never happen. It would never happen.
Yeah.
Gives me goosebumps reading that and hearing that, because it was such reverence. They all put their cameras down, and you're right, there's no photo of that awful moment in her life. I'm getting goosebumps right now thinking about it. And so let's jump for a moment from 1952 to 1979. This has to be difficult for you to talk about, because this, after all, is your grandfather. So your mother's father, of course, your grandfather, Lord Louis Mountbatten, was tragically assassinated in 1979. He had, listeners, an enormous influence, if you're not aware, on the modern British royal family, specifically Prince Philip and the now King Charles. I mean, this is a kind of asinine question, because of course she was devastated, but how did your mother handle this loss, so violent and unexpected? It had to be one of the tragedies of her life.
Absolutely. And the reason that I include this in the book is that I think it's important for people to recognize that my mother, of course, came from a very privileged background and had these extraordinary parents, and she traveled a great deal and saw amazing luxury and had amazing opportunities that, of course, otherwise wouldn't have been afforded to someone. But she also had a life that was tainted with great tragedy, and the most public of which was the assassination of my grandfather in 1979 in Ireland. We were all there on holiday. Every summer we would holiday in Sligo, and it was devastating for my mother. She was also the only adult on the ground left coping with my grandfather's death, her sister being on a life support machine, her beloved brother-in-law being on death's door, losing her nephew to the bomb, and her sister's mother-in-law, and our wonderful local boat boy who helped every summer. I mean, it was tragedy and incredibly difficult. But I think that there are incredible lessons to be learnt from that. My family said that they were not going to let this lead a life of bitterness afterwards, that they were going to not let the display of the IRA's capacity for violence infiltrate the family's life, and that my mother and my aunt were going to move forward with examples of great forgiveness. And in fact, my aunt gently recovered without bitterness and with a lot of humor. In fact, she called it her IRA facelift. But you know, it was difficult. And when I asked my mother about it and about grief and understanding in general, she said, you know, you always do have to look at things from other people's perspectives. And when she talks about, you know, seeing so many friends now leave and die and being left without them, she said, of course, be grateful that you knew them and had the chance to love them, and happy that you have had the memories of them. But you have to look forward. You can't look back.
Mm. Can you tell us about the marriage of your parents, Lady Pamela Hicks and David Hicks?
Absolutely. I think, you know, my father was very unexpected choice for my mother. He didn't come at all from the same background. He came from a design world, which my mother knew nothing. But he was very dashing, and it was a very exciting life. But of course, she learned very early on that David Hicks was like nobody else she'd ever met before. On one of her first dates with him, she turned up with her what she thought was a rather chic little car, which was in dusty pink and blue, and she parked in front of his front door in Cheyne Walk in London for this first date. And he came down and he saw the car and he thought it was the most hideous thing he'd ever seen. And he said, please, could you go and park it 2 streets away in case somebody feels that it might be associated with me? So he got learned early on how it was going to be with David Hicks.
I'm just whenever I think about you, and now that I've learned a little bit more about your father through this book, him too, and your mother, I just think of style and chic to the core. And you write in the book, at 95 years of age, my mother maintains herself with impeccable style and an abiding charm that make her a cherished institution and perhaps the last of her kind. Tell us what you mean by that, because that's really beautiful.
Well, I think that, you know, that is a generation that we won't see again, you know, generation that's lived through a war and a time and a part of history that unfolded. And it was a unique life, certainly for my mother. But I think that, you know, she is someone who has endured quite a lot. Not only did she have to live through the terrible tragedy of my grandfather's assassination, but she then developed breast cancer. And in fact, in the book, there are really only 1 or 2 sentences about that, because my mother absolutely maintained that, you know, she didn't want it to have any self-pity. She didn't want to make a fuss. In fact, she asked the gardener to drive her to the hospital. And we as children were very unaware of this extraordinary chapter of her life where she had to overcome breast cancer at a time where medicine wasn't nearly as modern as it is today. And it was at great risk that she had to go through what she did. But, you know, just again, a lesson about endurance with no sense of fuss or self-pity. She also talks about introspection and that you need to be self-aware but not self-occupied, and I think that's very interesting as well. So I do think that there is much to be learnt from these 95 years of this life. But she does have an amazing sense of humor and a great sense of fun. And we see that on the tiny clips that I do on my Instagram, which is India Hicks Style. I know I'm very lucky to have a following there, but mainly it's people longing to see clips of my mum because she is very funny indeed. And I think that her sense of humor, a wicked sense of humor, was inherited from her father, and her father was very funny indeed. And he once addressed 500 boys at the Dragon School in Oxford in England, 1977. Amongst them was my brother and my cousins Nicholas and Timothy. And my brother remembers him saying to this assembled crowd of young boys, I remember being your age at school in my boarding house. And on the first evening, we all went up to the 2nd floor and had a competition to see who could lean furthest over the banisters. I won. When they picked me up off the ground, I had surprisingly few injuries, which, of course, these young boys listening to this old man tell them that roared with laughter and thought it was marvelous. But my grandfather did have this great wicked sense of humor. And my mother very much has inherited that. She has a comedic timing when she tells these brilliant stories that she remembers. And as I said, I do try to capture them and post them on Instagram because, again, I think it's just wonderful that we're able to see this and hear this.
Mm.
As listeners close out reading this book, what do you hope that they've learned and take away from the read?
Well, that I think, my mother says the words duty and service are words we don't hear enough. She was put to work at a very early age. She was told that even though, she didn't have a need for the money, she was to work simply for the cause. And I think, the words, to whom much is given, much is expected, is very relevant here, especially my mother's life, about loyalty and service, endurance, introspection, curiosity. She also, when she was in India, spent a lot of time during those late teenage years living amongst Muslims and Sikhs and Christians and Buddhists. And she said she never felt any division. And in fact, she was very appreciative of the way she had been brought up without any prejudice or suspicion of any other religious groups. And I think the world today, we're in a terrible mess. And I think that just my mother's words there are very important. There's much to learn from that we shouldn't be prejudiced or suspicious of other religious groups. And as mentioned already, she very much feels that, having a curious mind is the secret to a broader life, and that manners are important, and that there is a sense of adventure is good in life. So I think that there's much that we can take from this book, quite apart from, as you have said, the beautiful imageries that we see. I dug deep in the archives, and thank goodness she kept absolutely everything. So the pages are filled with beautiful memorabilia and press clippings and vintage photographs and dusty invitations and wonderful things that otherwise would have been just hidden away inside these boxes and boxes and boxes. So I'm thrilled and delighted that I was able to do a book that showcases this remarkable life.
Well, I can imagine that when writing this book and combing through the photos for it, that you learned so much about your mother's rich life and your mother's story that you didn't know before. And we enjoyed this book and have enjoyed this conversation so much. And our last question for you is, when you think about your mother, what has she meant to your life and to the world? And what do you think your mother's legacy will be ultimately? How will history remember her?
Claire loves flair. Tom's into bootcut. Ava likes denim on denim. And Sarah is all about a cropped jean jacket. Whatever your denim look is, Walmart's got you covered. Find the things you love at Walmart.
Freshly made ravioli or hand-pulled ramen noodles. When you dine with Chase Sapphire Reserve, either will be amazing. Because it's the choice between a front row seat at the chef's table while getting a live demo of how to make ravioli, or dining family style as you hear the story behind your ramen broth. This weekend it's ravioli. Next weekend, ramen. Find the detail that moves you with immersive dining experiences from Sapphire Reserve. Chase, make more of what's yours. Learn more at chase.com/Sapphire Reserve.
Cards issued by JP Morgan Chase Bank, N.A. member FDIC, subject to credit approval.
Well, I hope that they will see that it was a life that was much more than just being a daughter to the last viceroy or a lady in waiting or the wife of someone, but actually she herself has led a very extraordinary, very unique and very individual life. I think, I hope that the book, people do see that there are these lessons to be learned. I certainly, see myself now very influenced by my mother, and the fact that I work a great deal with this organization called Global Empowerment Mission, who are a disaster relief agency, and I got very involved with them probably because of my mother's inspiring story of how she worked for a lot of these charities and foundations and causes. And I spent a lot of time going out to Ukraine, right out to the front line, working with a team that Global Empowerment Mission have put in place. They're in fact in Asheville right now, working very hard in the aftermath of that terrible hurricane there. We're in 54 different countries. So I don't just sit on their board. Now I'm boots on the ground, literally for them. I'm going out to Baku as part of the COP conference in November. So it's my great honor to work for this foundation and be part of this organization. And I hope make in some part a small difference to them, but that I am very much an active part of their team. And all of that absolutely was inspired and instilled in me by my mother and her life of duty and service.
Well, this book's extraordinary photos are only outmatched by the extraordinary words that go along with them. And for our listeners, you really don't want to miss this one. It's called Lady Pamela, My Mother's Extraordinary Years as Daughter to the Viceroy of India, Lady in Waiting to the Queen, and Wife of David Hicks. And it is out as of September 3rd, so you can get it now. And thank you so much for being here today with us, India. We had a great conversation with you.
Well, I can't thank you enough. I worry I sounded a little serious throughout this.
Not at all. No, we enjoyed this so much. It was beautiful.
Good. Well, there's lots of fun stories in the book to
Oh,
be
no
told
question.
that aren't deeply serious. And also, as I said, on my Instagram account, you will see lots of flashes of Lady Pamela, and you'll get a sense of who she is and how much fun she can be too.
Well, check out the book, listeners, and check out the Instagram. We'll add that in the show notes. Thank you again so much.
Thank you very much for having me on.